Thanks for joining me for this Kansas Teaching and Leading Project webinar on universal screening for adolescent readers. I'm Denise Brown, and I currently serve as a state reading trainer for the Kansas MTSS and Alignment Project. It's our partnership with the Literacy Network of Kansas and the Kansas Teaching and Leading Project, as well as Kansas State Department of Ed, that allows us to bring this webinar to you today. I have 5 objectives for our time together. First, I'd like to visit with you about why we would actually even screen adolescent students, and we'll talk about the differences between screeners and other assessments you might be currently using. We'll look at some appropriate screening assessments for students in grades 6 through 12 and make some initial interpretations, as well as talk about what the implications might be for your core, not just in ELA, but across other content areas. So if you're ready, we'll get started. Our first objective is simply a question. Why would you universally screen students in grades 6 through 12? If you would go to the doctor today, there are certain things that we know he will do for you, regardless of why you've gone to see him. We know he's going to take your blood pressure and weigh you, take your temperature, and while none of those things may tell the doctor exactly what is wrong, they are an indication of some sort of risk or that something is going wrong. And there's a universal threshold or benchmark that signals. So besides our weight, there is a threshold for blood pressure. There's a threshold for temperature that are a signal of risk. In that same way, we need some type of screener, if you will, at a school so that we are able to quickly assess what students might possibly be at risk for failure in reading. When we have a quick and efficient way to screen students for possible risk, we really save time as a school staff. Often we fall in one of two camps. We either are not assessing students for possible risk, or we're giving students deep, long, cumbersome assessments that take so much time that we lose actual instructional face-to-face time with students. I have a superintendent friend who refers to that as always weighing the cow but never actually feeding it. So we need a way that we can very quickly assess which students may or may not be at risk, just the same way your doctor does that quick assessment. Once that's done, we need to decide how we'll review that data and make some good decisions. We don't want to collect data that we will never actually use. This brings me to my second objective. Let's talk about the difference between those universal screeners and maybe some other assessments that you are currently using in your district. Generally speaking, schools use 2 types of assessments. The first is a summative assessment. Summative assessments are administered after instruction to measure students' learning against a defined set of objectives or content standards. So they're a big picture. They give us a chance to look at how students have done after instruction. So we would include things like end-of-unit tests, your state assessments, course grades. All of those are measuring on the back side. Formative assessment, on the other hand, is assessment that happens to actually help us design instruction. So it's brief, it's very efficient, it's designed to catch children before they fail so that I can reframe or restructure. It catches misconceptions by students. So things like our progress monitoring, our universal screener, or at Tier 1, your exit tickets, all of those things are designed to inform instruction rather than measure after the fact. For schools that have a multi-tiered system of support, these are the 4 types of assessments that you might see as part of their assessment plan. The first 3 really are formative in nature. We have the universal screener, which we're talking about today, which is designed truly just to give that first shakeout of students who might be at risk for reading failure. We also have progress monitoring assessments that are formative, and that they allow us to measure the amount of progress that a student is making towards that goal if they're in an intervention. Informal diagnostics are not what we would typically see used for, say, special education identification, but they're really designed to pick up very specific reading skills and to show a teacher where along the spectrum of phonics or phonological awareness a student's skills might have stopped or find even missing skills. Finally, the state assessments and your achievement measures really are your summative ones, and those again are there to measure overall growth after the fact. So let's talk about the characteristics of a good academic screener. We know it needs to be valid and reliable, and we need to have the ability to administer it to all students in our building 3 times a year. We want it to be formative in nature so that it does, in fact, inform our instruction. And it should be able to measure the accuracy and fluency of those very critical skills that we've identified at different grade levels for students as they become readers. Finally, it should have some standardized administration so that it wouldn't matter who gave it, we would all give it the same way. And those directions should be very specific. In addition, we need those academic screeners to measure the predictive indicators for that particular grade level. So for example, we would not expect a 6th grade screener to measure every single phonics pattern that's taught. We might use that in an informal diagnostic manner, but the screener would just be measuring what we know is predictive for that time. But we do want it to be sensitive to even the smallest increments of change, which is why an assessment like oral reading fluency can show growth of just 1 word correct per minute. We'd like to see multiple forms of this so we can use it not just for a screener but also for progress monitor, and those forms need to be equally difficult. Finally, we want a system that can allow us to look at data not just at the individual student, but at the classroom, the grade, and the building, and finally the entire district. Analyzing at the systems level would be having reports that would allow us to look at what % of our students are functioning at benchmark. It would also let us look at the effectiveness of our Tier 1 instruction, our Tier 2 and Tier 3 programs. A good system should let you shake groups out by subgroups so that I would be able to see if one group is doing well with what we're currently doing and yet another subgroup is struggling. So all of those are pieces of a really strong academic screener. If you're wanting to evaluate your current universal screener or you're in the market for a new one, there are 3 key terms I would really take the time to look at. How that assessment scores, and you'd find that information in the technical manual, and it's buried way back, usually towards the back. The first is to look at that universal screener's sensitivity. It's the ability for it to truly identify with some accuracy which students truly are at risk and which students truly are not. So we're looking at how many false positives or false negatives that you're getting. We're looking for a coefficient of at least 0.65. 1 would be perfect if you could 100% guarantee that you were identifying which kids did and which kids did not need help. That would be perfect. So at least 0.65 gets us a place to start. Keep in mind that with all universal screeners, we do want to validate that data when we give it to a student. So that gives us a second level, but we want that first screen really to be fairly sensitive to which students are in fact at risk. We also want to look at that screener's ability to have some predictive validity. In other words, is it able to project if a student continues on their current path where they will be the next time we screen them? When we look at the work of Russell Gersten, again, he says we need to look for a predictive validity of about 0.6. Finally, we want to look at the reliability of that universal screener. And you'll notice that the coefficient for this is just a little bit higher. I see reliability a couple of different ways. When we're looking at consistency and accuracy, if I would give it, for example, as a 7th grade teacher and my colleague would give that same student the same assessment, we should get relatively the same responses. Years ago, I worked with a district that had an informal reading assessment, and it took about an hour to give per student, and it was given one-on-one, which already this doesn't fit as a screener because it's obviously too much time. But when I asked the teachers how similar your scores would be, they said, oh gosh, they were never very similar at all. Those are red flags. That's not a reliable assessment. The other thing about reliability is it ought to be consistent as far as measuring risk with other assessments. So when you see one that's been produced, they'll often show in their technical guide, here's how student scores on this, and this is how closely our score would compare same student with this assessment that's been well established. So 3 things to really look at very carefully when you start to look at your current one or begin to shop for a new universal screener. So we've talked about why we should screen students in grades 6 through 12, and we've talked about the difference between a screener, which is formative in nature, versus more of the summative measures that we give, and that it's quick and efficient versus something that's a little more cumbersome like a diagnostic. Now let's talk about some things that might fit under that appropriate screening for students in grades 6 through 12. So when we think about an appropriate screener for students in grades 6 through 12, you see the bullets on this slide really are a summary of what we've already talked about. So components that we would be looking for in a typical screener. Keep in mind that an appropriate screener at this grade level might not measure all 5 areas of reading. It might instead just measure those that are appropriate for this grade level. Sticking with our medical model, we wouldn't want our doctor to give us every screener at his disposal just because it's there. And likewise, we want to make sure we're staying quick and efficient when we're choosing an appropriate screener so that we know that we've got a good chance of catching students that are at risk without spending a lot of time. Here are some examples of universal screening instruments. This is not by any means an all-inclusive list, but ones that we are typically seeing used in Kansas and ones that would meet the requirements right now for the dyslexia task force. The last 2, STAR and NWEA MAP, tend to be used primarily in grades 9 through 12, while the others tend to be used in grades 6 through 12. So the dyslexia task force has some required screeners for dyslexia. And right now, for grades 6 through 12, all students need to be screened 3 times a year on a nationally normed grade level reading comprehension assessment. So some pretty key terms there. This cannot be a teacher created. It can't be something that I've just picked out of my curriculum and used. It has to be nationally normed, and it also has to be grade level. Some of your students, based on how they perform on that reading comprehension assessment, will also need an oral reading fluency screening. So we've talked about why you should screen and the difference between a screener and maybe other assessments that you're giving students. We've looked at some typical assessments, ones that would be appropriate for grades 6 through 12. Now let's talk about how you might interpret that data. You've gathered it, we've weighed the cow, now let's start to feed it. So when you're ready to sit down with your team and begin to interpret the scores, I think it's important to make sure first and foremost that screener has been given exactly as it was designed. So did we train people in how to administer the different components to make sure that kids got the same directions so we don't invalidate the norms? I also think it's important to validate the actual screening results, and we can validate that by class. I have a school I worked with several years ago who was getting ready to give a group assessment, a group screener, and they were in the science room, and the one wall was just completely glass. And they said, I kid you not, Denise, the minute I said begin, a crazy snowfall started. And it was those giant snowflakes that came out of nowhere, and it was very unexpected. And they said, we know that test was invalid because the students' heads snapped. They said, as a teacher, my head snapped and watched it as well. So they knew that was a group they were going to want to give that to again. So you could validate as a group, but I think more often you're going to find that there are places you need to validate by individual students. Like it or not, sometimes kids bring things with them. They're not feeling well, there are issues at home, there are issues with friends that might make that score not valid. So we always encourage teachers in grades 6 through 12 to lay that assessment score next to what they already know about the student. What do their course grades look like? What does their attendance look like? Does this match the student that we see on a daily basis? And if not, it probably warrants a little deeper dig to see if in fact that screening is appropriate. Sometimes you'll look at your scores and find such a huge number of students in need for intervention. You're going to need to talk about possibly a class-wide intervention at grade 6 or a building-wide strategy in grades 7 through 12. We will probably have to plan on giving some diagnostic assessments to students who show that they are below the target, just to give us a little bit more information to find out what comes next for them. And sometimes we know that there's going to be more information we're going to need on those students that are just right on the bubble. They barely were above the risk cut, or they were barely below the risk cut. Again, those are students that we would validate before we made a determination on what was going to happen next. As you begin to interpret those results, sometimes it's helpful to have a flowchart to follow, and KSDE has put together a nice screening flowchart to help lead you through the steps for that initial decision making. This is just a small snippet of that flowchart in the screenshot, but you see the link below that will take you directly to this. Eventually it'll become how you do business, but those first few times through, to ensure that you're following the steps that you need to find the right students who need support, this is a great resource. Okay, we're at objective number 5. We've talked about why and the difference between the types of screeners that you're giving and appropriate screeners that would work for students in grades 6 through 12. We started the conversation about how to initially make some decisions around that data. Objective 5 is to take you a little deeper on some possible implications for your Tier 1 or across your content areas at Tier 1, where a reading screener is concerned. We know from research that a general rule of thumb is if about 80% of your students are performing at benchmark, your Tier 1 is really doing its job. When you get a lot below 80%, we're putting way too much pressure on Tier 2 and Tier 3, and it's very hard to sustain and intervene enough to take care of the students that have that many needs. So if you're seeing less than 80% of your students demonstrating benchmark skills on your universal screener, we would encourage you to really evaluate your current building-wide reading strategies and practices. What I mean by that is when we look at students in grades 7 through 12, I think it's important to note that if we teach reading skills in isolation, say just in the ELA classes, Carolyn Denton tells us that middle school and high school students have the idea of compartmentalization, which means simply this. If I'm in your classroom and you show me a vocabulary strategy of what to do when I hit a word I don't know the meaning, I don't realize that I can take that and use that in my science class and then in my social studies class or any other class when I come across a word that I don't understand. For whatever reason, middle and high school students, Denton says, tend to compartmentalize, and they see that strategy that you've taught as part of your curriculum. It's what I'm doing for a grade in your class, not something that I can take and use across all content. So when we're looking at those adolescent readers, we're really talking about how do we install some practices across the building that are consistent, so we don't have a million different ways to learn a vocabulary word, but it's the same. So not only does it keep us from compartmentalizing, but even more important, it frees up that student's working memory. If everyone has a different vocab strategy, my working memory is tied up in trying to learn your strategy instead of learning the word. So if we all have the same strategy, all of a sudden working memory is freed to actually learn that vocabulary or whatever practice you're trying to address. So it's a really good conversation to have if you're falling below 80%. What are our building-wide strategies and practices? Some really important tasks for your district and building leadership teams when we think about universal screeners would be to identify the PD that needs to happen. We don't want to just adopt a new universal screener and not train people in how to use it. We also are going to have to think about how we're going to allocate some resources. It's going to take some time to learn to administer, but also time to interpret the results and talk as a collaborative team about what we're seeing. Obviously, you're going to have materials involved in giving that assessment, whether it's an annual fee for an online version or printed version. There's some materials involved, so we'll have to think about that as we build that budget. Leaders are also going to have to develop some sort of an action plan. So we say, here's by this date, this is our assessment timeline, if you will. Here's when we'll be giving Universal Screener in fall, winter, and spring. And not only will we set those out there, but we'll also need to find a way to monitor implementation. Making sure it's done or a compliance task is one thing. Ensuring that they've been done with fidelity is also something that falls on the lap of district and building leadership teams. Making sure that they're given correctly and also interpreted correctly. Boy, we've covered a lot in a short amount of time. I want to leave you with some next steps if you're beginning to explore what universal screening might look like in your district or in your classroom. First, I'd encourage you to see what grade level reading comprehension assessments you already have that your district is giving, or think about the ones that you're currently giving in your classroom. Not only are they being given, but then how are we using that data to make some decisions for students? And then second, if you're a teacher in grades 7 through 12 and you're giving strictly a reading comprehension measure at this point, I want to encourage you to begin to take some informal data in your own classroom. If you're seeing the need for a building-wide strategy, begin to listen to how your students read. What are you hearing? Do you hear them making a lot of mistakes? Do you hear them reading like a robot? What are the characteristics that you're hearing? Listen to how they speak and how they write. Are they using lots of pronouns? Is their language very specific to your content, or is it pretty basic and ambiguous? Those would be indications of a possible vocabulary issue. So begin to think about, what are you seeing informally from your students? And then what might that anecdotal data begin to tell you about a possible building-wide strategy that would support all of your students? Well, I'm honored that you would take time out of your busy day to spend time with me talking about universal screeners. I think screeners for students in grades 6 through 12 is an area that's been somewhat neglected in comparison to what we've done with early readers. This module has been developed with funds from the Literacy Network of Kansas. It is a Striving Readers Comprehensive Literacy Initiative, and it's done in partnership with the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning. This grant was awarded to the Kansas State Department of Education, and it's been designed to improve literacy at not only the state level, but regional and community as well. And it's done in partnership today with the Kansas Teaching and Leading Project. If you'd like more information on this topic or on the modules that have been developed as part of this project, please feel free to email Cindy Haddocky or Joanne McCrell at KSDE. Their emails are on this screen, as is mine. You'll also find a link to your certificate of completion, your quiz, and the PowerPoint slides that we've used today. Once again, thanks for joining us.